Hey, welcome back to HVAC Technician Talk. I'm John Israel. I'll tell you what, man, the weather in Louisiana really has warmed up. It's hot. Except for today, it decided to rain and the temperature dropped like a rock. But other than that, it's been in the mid 80s. Phone's been ringing a little bit, so I'm excited about that. Uh, got some jobs lined up, been doing some service calls. Things been pretty good with the hot weather coming in. But hey, today I want to talk to you about compressors. We're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about compressor changeouts and why I don't use suction line dryers. And also we're going to talk about compressor blankets. I hate compressor blankets and I'll explain why. But first, we're going to talk about changing out a compressor. Basically how I do it and why I don't use suction line dryers. So, when I change a compressor, if it's a mechanical failure, you don't need a suction line dryer or anything like that. But if it's an electrical burnout, a lot of people use suction line dryers. I don't. I use acid away. Here's why I don't use suction line dryers. Suction line dryers are meant to be removed after a certain period of time. They're not meant to stay in place. Although we all have been on units with suction line dryers, and they've been there for years. I took out a leaking one today. Okay. That's why I don't use them, because they leak. And they're not meant to stay in place for a long period of time. I mean, if you read, it tells you, I think you're supposed to leave it in for like a week or so and then reclaim the refrigerant, cut the dryer out, replace it with a piece of pipe, and put virgin refrigerant back into the system. But in all reality, we know we can't get a customer to pay for all of that, and nobody's doing it. And that's why I don't use suction line dryers, because they're not meant to stay in place and I don't like them. I really don't. So when I change a compressor, I always try to cut it out instead of unsweating it. Sometimes you can't do that on the hot gas line, though, because where the hot gas line enters the compressor, it reduces down. And if you cut that reducer off, you're screwed. So most of the time I will unsweat the hot gas line and cut the suction. 99% of the time I've got plenty of slack to where I can cut the suction line. And then I take the new compressor, and before I put it in place, I'll actually take a bottle of acid away and just pour it in the compressor, like in the suction line of the compressor, of the new compressor. And I've had very, very good success with changing out burnout compressors that way. The acid away, I think it's made by Rector Seal. It does a really good job. It does a really, really good job. And I don't have to use a suction line dryer. And, like I said, suction line dryers are meant to be removed. And not only that, it's another leak point. It's another dryer to rust. And it's got 2 Schrader cores on it. So that's 2 more spots it can leak. And look, if you use a suction line dryer, don't come at me with, oh, I've been using suction line dryers for 30 years and ain't had no trouble. Look, I'm not saying if you use a suction line dryer, I'm not saying you're wrong. And I'm not saying it's wrong to use them. I'm just telling you why I don't, is all. Okay. If you use them and you like that practice with a burnout compressor, more power to you. But they're not meant to stay in place. They're meant to be removed. The charge is supposed to be removed, and virgin refrigerant is supposed to be put back in its place. Again, but if you use suction line dryers and you've been using them for X amount of years and you leave them in place and all that, that's great. I mean, if it works for you and that's what you like, hey, no issue here. I'm just explaining, why I don't like them and why I don't use them. I've had great success with that acid away. And it does really well for me. So I just don't use suction line dryers. I use the acid away, and it's been very successful for me. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's why I don't use them, and I choose to use acid away. All right, now I want to transition into compressor blankets. I don't like compressor blankets. Here's why. One, they don't really reduce sound. I'm sorry, they don't. I've taken them off on maintenances and you can't tell the difference. Um, so I don't like compressor blankets. Another big problem with compressor blankets, I had one the other day. Compressor blankets will they will rot out the compressor shell around where the hot gas line and the suction line go into the compressor. I have seen them cause that to literally rot and crack the shell of the compressor. I have removed blankets on maintenances or service calls because they're crumbling. And that's another thing. After so many years, they start crumbling and falling apart. Now, it also depends on the material of the compressor blanket. Uh, like the ones ICP use, they're kind of like a silky type material, but like most of the other ones are, I can't explain it, but uh the material is, I don't know, I can't explain what kind of material it is, but I mean, I have literally seen them rot away around where the hot gas line goes in, or the suction line, and it'll crack the shell of the compressor and cause a refrigerant leak. I went on a system the other day that was leaking, and I couldn't find the leak until I pulled the blanket off, and it had cracked the shell around the hot gas discharge line. Nothing I was able to solder. It didn't crack the hot gas line or the brass or the copper. It actually rotted away the shell of the compressor, and that's where it was leaking. So that's my big issue with compressor blankets, is they don't reduce sound. I've taken them off and you cannot tell a difference. I've ran them with them and without them. To me, you cannot tell a difference. But I mean, that's not the big problem. The big issue that I have is what I'm talking about, is them rotting away the around the hot gas line and around the suction line. It rots and causes rust around that shell of that compressor, and it'll excuse me, and it'll actually crack them. It'll crack the shell of that compressor and cause a refrigerant leak. So if I'm doing a maintenance on a system or a service call and I've got to pull the top off of it to get leaves out or whatever, I usually take the blanket off. The blanket comes off. Most of the time, they're in such bad shape anyway. They're all deteriorated and dry rot. So you barely touch it and it wants to crumble to pieces. Now, I'll tell you what some good blankets were. And that was the ones that went around the old train Climate-Tough compressor, because they didn't go around the hot gas line and the suction line. They just kind of went around the bottom and the middle of the compressor. Those were pretty good blankets. Well, they had two different type of blankets. They had a blanket that was like a half cover, and then they did have a full cover blanket as well. But the material that they used was really good, and it didn't really cause those problems. But you take like, York or Goodman and Amana, and I've some Root and Ream ones I've taken off. The material that they use on those blankets is just not good, and they rot away. So anyway, yeah, that's really that's my issue with those. I'd love to hear you guys' feedback on it. And again, if you like blankets, that's great. I'm just telling you why I don't uh like them. I know that there are aftermarket universal blankets that a lot of people sell as an accessory. And again, if you like blankets or use blankets or sell compressor blankets, that's fine. I'm not saying it's wrong or anything like that. But do beware of that, because they will rot away around those lines and crack the shell of that compressor. So yeah, that's my issue with those. Well, guys, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast and watching on YouTube. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk and see you. We will see and talk to you guys on the next one.
Thanks for listening to the HVAC Technician Talk podcast. We're always looking for recommendations on topics for the show. You can text us at 337-541-1252 or email us at hvactechniciantalk@gmail.com. We'll talk to y'all on the next one.